Are you an assassin? I'm a soldier. You're neither. You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect the bill.
The legend that is Brando lives on in our memories, not so much for the watches he owned and wore, but because of how he changed the world of acting. Method acting, facial expressions, action and emphasis with his use of words, true acting. And many of you may know he was a big proponent of Rolex watches, even more so than most of the others who climbed onto the bandwagon decades later. This man was wearing a Rolex throughout the 50s and beyond. But the one watch that has become as iconic as the film itself is the Rolex 1675 GMT that Brando wore as Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. For more information on the watch, I will link to James Stacy's article for Hodinkee in the description below, since I'm sure most of you know that the watch has been found in recent months. Apocalypse Now, if we were to summarize it as a movie, is a journey down a rabbit hole. How the key character finds himself retracing the steps of a highly respected man who went absent without leave. And through his journey, Captain Willarad begins to lose his sense of perception as well, learning that the jungle and its inhabitants have other agendas that he is not a part of. The characters in his team all gradually become unhinged, many of them being killed as they travel down a river where each point is worse than the last. For anyone who has watched the film, we can all agree that it is a roller coaster ride, until they meet Kurtz at the end of the film. It is almost as if the situation changes and the film slows down completely. We can all assume that Kurtz has gone mad. He holds himself accountable for all the men under his command dying. He is mentally broken and unstable, but he has also woken up from the sedative that is the killer instinct. He knows and understands the consequences of his actions and hates himself for it. He sees the lies that the news tells the public about the war in Vietnam, but at the same time sees through the military ideal and all that he has worked for his entire life. It's actually a very sad story when you think of it that way. There is also a direct link between him and Captain Willarad. He sees himself in Willarad, the naivety. And as a character, Kurtz at this point of the film is reckless. We could even say aimless. He knows what's going to happen. He doesn't fight when Willarad eventually kills him. In the back of his mind, Kurtz wishes for Willarad to take over his position. The film looks at a lot of themes, and if you know what a living hell it was behind the scenes, it's incredible to think that this film was made. Even during filming, there was no clear direction about how it would develop, what it meant, or how the film would actually end. Kurtz as a character has many underlying traits that we can all identify differently, but returning to his watch, his Rolex GMT is a fascinating character in the film as well. The 1675 GMT is one of the longest-running Rolex sports references, very much in tandem with the 1016 Explorer. This reference lasted for 21 years before being superseded by the 16750. The design of the watch itself cemented the Pepsi GMT as one of the most recognizable watches in the world, and one of the most sought-after Rolex sports watches. One aspect that has always fascinated me about the reference is the case design. We would have expected the watch to use a Submariner case back in the day. It would have made the exercise a lot cheaper to just use one universal case for all the references, like what Rolex does nowadays for the most part. But the 1675 case was slimmer, the lugs were different. The crown size, crown guards, the bezel, many of the components had small changes to them that made the watch all the more subtle. One of the best examples to see this case design is referring back to the reference 1655, a watch that I believe uses the same case design as the 1675. Even here we see a case design that is slightly different. The lugs are ever so slightly thicker, but it is easy to discern the form of the case when the watch uses a solid steel bezel. It's much harder to do that when colors are involved. The GMT that Brando wore was a model bought in 1972, and a watch that very much shares the same DNA as the 1655 of the same time period. But this watch had a twist to it though, or lack thereof. Its bezel was removed. The story goes that when he asked to wear the watch, he was told to make it unidentifiable. I have a feeling that there wasn't an urge to have Rolex affiliated to such a film. And when he returned with the watch, it didn't have a bezel. For all we know, he might have done it himself, like how he engraved the caseback of the watch himself too. But in reality, there's nothing special about the GMT. Sure, it's sought after now because it's a watch that was owned and worn by Marlon Brando, but the reference itself wasn't rare. It didn't spark a movement like the Paul Newman Daytona did, and I'll link to a video in the corner discussing a small detail about why the Rolex Daytona has become so overhyped and overrated. But provenance and collectability aside, this is an example of a watch that actually has a presence. It shows something innate to the character of Kurtz in the film. Let's divide up the watch into three parts: the case, the bracelet, and the bezel. What does the case represent? It is the housing for the watch, the most important aspect of the watch. What does the bracelet represent? In a few words, I would describe it as safety, security, formality. And what does the bezel represent? A function to the watch, but also containment, a component that brings all the external parts together, but also a ceiling, the highest permissible level that the watch could ever reach. So what do we see with a Rolex GMT that doesn't have a bracelet or a bezel? It appears to be a watch that is misguided. It seems naked, stripped of formalities, lacking a clear purpose. The watch has lost some of its most integral external components, and maybe feels cleaner and more concise because of it. Could we then say that, in a similar vein, this is how the character of Kurtz changed? He began his service as a polished, well-fitting GMT, with all of its parts intact and cared for. But as he changed, he lost these formalities. He lost sight of his purpose. Maybe it's a good thing, though. Maybe in its current state it is less cluttered and more refined. We can consider the GMT's transformation to move in both directions, for better and for worse. It is no longer original and perfect. At the same time, it is tailored to be a bare-bones instrument. So the case is the body, the bezel is the mind, and the bracelet could be considered the security of the soul, the part that truly makes the watch identifiable to others. With the bezel gone, it is as if the container has been opened. His mind has been relieved of the duty to follow orders or commit to his function. With the bracelet gone, he has lost his security. He is no longer identifiable or has a clear identity. Of course, this is all just circumstantial. Of course, none of this was planned or intended for his role. But like how after decades, the film is still being analyzed and interpreted differently, I like to think the watch deserves more recognition for the role it played in the film. We have heard of perfect castings for characters, the perfect watch castings, like the choice of the Submariner or the Seamaster for James Bond, the Rolex Day-Date for Glengarry Glen Ross, the Explorer for Don Draper. Like all of the above watches, Brando's GMT shows a near direct link to Kurtz and an added depth to his character.